Good morning. Today I prepared a little video to go over the rubric I'll be using as I grade your essay. Your essays are due tomorrow at 6 o'clock. That's Friday at 6 o'clock. I wanted to remind you of that. You will be turning them in through turnitin.com. You will not be locked out if you turn it in late, so it's better to be late than never for sure. But do try to get your paper in on time so I don't have to deduct any late points. Before we get started, I wanted to say that I've kind of enjoyed looking at your outlines, and I hope that I've made some comments that some of you found to be helpful as you start writing. And a lot of you, I tried to give you some pointers, and I hope I wasn't too heavy-handed in suggesting some revisions. Okay, this rubric that I'm about to go over also appears at the end of your assignment as a paper, so you can have it to look at as you revise your paper and make sure you don't forget any details that you need to include. Also, before I get started, I wanted to make sure that you guys did see the information I sent out yesterday, or that you've seen it somewhere else, the information about the senior spotlight that Mrs. Witherow is doing on social media. So on Facebook and Instagram, they're putting information about each senior who's willing to send in pictures or even a short brief video. And maybe if you've been on one of those sites, you've seen some. I think there are 3 out there so far. This is the information you need to be in the Lion Pride Spotlight. So try to send in a picture or the short video to Mrs. Witherow's email address, which is here on this page, or send it to the Facebook page at the address shown here. They are also hoping you'll give them a little statement about some of your favorite memories or high school activities. The deadline is the same as your paper deadline, Friday, April 10th at 6 p.m. Okay, so let's talk about the rubric. One thing I always look at, of course, is the format of your paper. I look for a correct MLA heading. If you forget what goes in the MLA heading, just do a quick Google and look at images of MLA headings and you'll be able to do it. The most common error is probably using the wrong date format. The date should be the day first, then the month, then the year, no punctuation. The other thing that is probably the most common error is extra spacing. The paper should be double spaced throughout, no extra spacing before or after titles. Titles should be in the same font size and the same font as the rest of the paper. Titles shouldn't be bolded, but they should be correctly capitalized and centered. They also should be fitting for your paper. Obviously, you want to document your sources correctly. For this paper, you're just using the primary sources, the short stories that we read, and I'm not asking you to do the full-on works cited citation. I'm only asking that you put page numbers at the end of quotations or specific descriptions from the story. And of course, if it is the short story 11 that you're writing about, don't worry about page numbers at all. It's very short and it doesn't really have page numbers. I am going to count format as about 20%. The other thing I look at is organization, and I'm hoping you guys will have a great organization, because really what I'm looking at there is your thesis statement and your topic sentences. You've sent those to me and I gave you feedback, so I'm hoping those are going to be awesome. And I will say this, that of all the classes I've ever taught, overall this class is the best I've ever had at writing good thesis statement and topic sentences. So kudos to you guys. Make sure that the points are arranged logically. So if you're describing events in the story, it makes more sense to, if you're discussing the guilt, for example, of Sonny's brother and Lieutenant Cross, and you're discussing how they change after they, experience this guilt. You want to keep it in that order. And most of you had a good logical order, but there were, I think, about 3 people that I suggested maybe you flip the order of your discussion. But think about those things. Okay, and this slide talks about what you need to do to have good paragraph development. Notice that I'm counting this as 40%, because this is where the hard work comes in. This is where the real thinking comes in. And this is one of the most difficult things for me or any teacher I know to get students to do, and that is to go on and do some discussing and analysis that's original, because you kind of have to take a chance. And I think sometimes we're afraid we're going to be wrong. But as long as we can support our discussion with evidence from the story, we should do okay. Make a pretty good case for your claim, and I will definitely give you some credit there. When I talk about paragraph development, I mean, of course, everything from the evidence that you put in to support your claim, such as quotations, either complete sentences that you quote, or maybe partial quotations, so we call embedded quotations, or even specific examples or events or descriptions from the story. And you always want to make sure that when you put that evidence in, it's clear to your reader. If it's a quotation, who is the speaker? Is it the narrator? Is it a specific character? And you also want to make sure the context is clear. When was this said? What's been going on that caused a person to say this? And then, of course, offer some analysis. Explain how this statement helps prove the claim that you've made in that topic sentence. And, try to state more than the obvious. So a lot of people, when they did the little character analysis that I had you do, quoted a statement in which the narrator from Sonny's Blues talks about how he sent a letter to Sonny, who was in jail, after the narrator's little daughter dies, and Sonny writes back, and his letter shows how, talks about how glad he was to hear from his brother, what it meant to him. And the narrator says, "I felt like a bastard." So a lot of people wrote that this meant that the narrator, felt really bad, really guilty when he got the letter back from Sonny. But that's pretty obvious. You don't even need to explain that. Instead, you need to kind of dig a little bit more. Maybe talk about the fact that the narrator has been holding a grudge ever since he and Sonny had an argument. And so even though Sonny got into this big trouble and got sent off to jail, he's still holding a grudge. And he's still, the last thing I think Sonny said to him was, well, I'm dead to you. And so he just doesn't write him until he has the shock of losing his own little daughter. And he realizes he's been petty, that he's been holding a grudge. And he writes, and he feels bad. So make sure your explanations are, a little more than the obvious. Also, in this part, when you're writing, you're writing a comparison essay. So you're going to have your introduction, then you'll have body paragraph 1. You'll be discussing one character. Then you're going to have body paragraph 2, and you're discussing another character. But you're discussing, the same kind of aspect of those two characters, or making the same point about those two characters. So in the second body paragraph, you want to make sure that you bring in some of that comparison. So if you're talking about how Lieutenant Cross tries to escape, the trauma and the fear that he has associated with the war by fantasizing about Martha, then in the next paragraph, and you're talking about Sonny's brother, you might say Sonny's brother tries to escape the fear he has that something is, that Sonny's going to die or become a drug addict or whatever, that he tries to escape that by just sort of pretending Sonny doesn't exist at all. So you want to kind of connect those ideas. And then finally, you want to check your paper for correctness. And, this should always be obviously something that you notice as you go along, but the last thing you look at also, and it can be kind of hard to look at it with your paper with fresh eyes and check it for correctness issues. And, you might say, hey, well, if I knew it wasn't correct, I would have corrected it. But there are oftentimes a lot of careless mistakes I see. For example, maybe proper nouns that are not capitalized, people's names that are not capitalized, punctuation that should be obvious that's missing, shifts in verb tense happen a lot. So those are some things I've listed. Look for those, notice what word has underlined and check it to see what the problem is. Some people actually read their papers backwards. And I don't mean like literally the last word and then the next to the last word, but just read the last sentence by itself in isolation and the next to the last sentence by itself in isolation. And that sort of makes you look at each sentence one at a time and notice things that you might not notice before, because every time I get a set of paper, some of you write sentence fragments, and I think if you just had read that in isolation, you would know it wasn't complete. You would know it was a sentence fragment, and that's a pretty serious error. So you want to check for those. Also, if there are certain errors you've made in the past, look specifically for those errors. And you're at home, maybe you have somebody at home who could read through it and tell you, oh, this doesn't make sense, or is this right? You can do that.